All right. Good afternoon to those east of the Rockies and good morning to those west of it. Thank you for joining us here for our panel discussion we've titled Holiday Doldrums, Police and First Responder Mental Health Awareness. I want to begin by welcoming each of our panelists. If you're watching all of this, you'll see we're short one at the moment and hoping he can join us here partway through. We'll begin with Dr. Coleman, who is a certified police and public safety psychologist. She holds her doctorate in clinical psychology from the University of Denver, as well as several certificates, including criminal profiling. But obviously, I want to emphasize that police and public safety psychologist for many of our attendees here. If you are in need, she is licensed as a psychologist in her home state of Arizona, also in California, Colorado, and Hawaii, which I'm sure she's willing to take more patients in. But she can provide telehealth in Delaware, Georgia, Illinois, Missouri, Nebraska, New Hampshire, Nevada, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, Texas, and Utah through an agreement. So if you're in need in those states, you can reach out to her as well. She is an executive board member of the International Association of Chiefs of Police and also a member of the National Sheriff's Association and the Society for Police and Criminal Psychology. So we're happy to have her with us here today. In keeping with ladies first, I want to introduce Chaplain Glorybelle Lillie, who is an ordained minister in California. She has been a chaplain there for 4 years, where she works one-to-one in helping officers stay mentally fit and help them deal with their trauma. Prior to that, she has worked as security and as the law enforcement liaison for Airbnb. And all of that stems from more than a decade on the job in San Jose, California, where she worked the night shift as a beat cop. Her journey here to join us today actually began with some personal tragedy, which she's agreed to share with us today. So I'm thankful to have her with us as well. Chief Neil Gang is an active police chief in California and has more than 30 years experience as a sworn officer. Most stunning after all of that is that he still looks so young. So we're happy to have him here with us today. He's worked across many levels of law enforcement and through several jurisdictions. He holds his Bachelor of Science in Justice Administration as well as a Master of Science in Law Enforcement and Public Safety Leadership. More importantly for us today, Chief Gang has long been an advocate of officer wellness and gives keynote addresses on the subject. He is the creator of the Astral Model and the host of the Six Pillar podcast. He is the chair of Officer Wellness Committee on the California Police Chief Association, and he's here to share with us all of that experience today. I will introduce our guest we're still waiting on, simply because I'm proud to know Chief Daryl Green. He is currently the Chief of Staff at Michigan State University Police Department and has been active in law enforcement since 1997. He worked more than a decade on the road as a patrol officer in what has become one of the most violent cities in America in the last 15 years. He dealt with trying to curb that violence as the chief of police. Also a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy, he holds a Master of Science in Police Science and a PhD in philosophy. So we'll be looking forward to him joining us as we get into our discussion today. I want to begin with a couple quick and dirty facts. Just to give our audience some background, we're talking about trauma for police and first responders here today. There's a meme that's been circulating that the average person will deal with 1.5 to 2 critical incidents throughout their life, where the average police officer will deal with over 800. Now, that meme came from the Morrow Law Center. I have been unable to reach them to verify their background in it. But some sites and some statistics that we can verify through Blue Health. Officer suicides in 2017 were 176 in the year. In 2018, 183. In 2019, reached 236. So we see a sharp increase in officer suicides. Now, through the Officer Down Memorial page, ODMP, officers killed in the line of duty, 186 in 2017, 187 in 2018. We're actually down to 155 in 2019, only to spike again in 2020. Now, 2020, also through research done by Diane Herman in an article she wrote for the Independent Sentinel, 2020 had record retirements across the U.S., record police retirements, averaging 50% more than our standard retirement rate. So something is going on out there. For those not in the line of duty, Dr. Coleman, can you begin by sharing with us, outlining what is a normal trauma experience and how people deal with that?
Yeah, so I think, as you mentioned, you're talking a lot about officer mental health and the critical incidents that officers go through. But to break it down even further, right, we're talking a lot about PTSD. And in order to understand what PTSD is, you have to understand what trauma is. And so simply the definition of trauma is, you can experience a trauma when you go through, see, or learn about an event that involves either actual or perceived death, serious injury, or some type of sexual violation. So to the general public, that could be witnessing a really bad car accident when you're driving for a vacation. That could be experiencing a sexual assault as a girl in college. It could be witnessing gang violence. It could be experiencing child abuse and so forth. There's all of these different types of traumatic events that a person can go through in their life. And just because a person experiences something that's traumatic doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to develop a disorder because of it, or even that they're going to have any kind of reaction. But some of the typical reactions that you might see would be things like intrusive memories, which would be just memories about what happened that caused some kind of emotional distress, flashbacks, which is like re-experiencing what happened, or having nightmares. People might have some avoidance, which means that they don't want to talk about what happened. They maybe, if it happened on a college campus, or if they witnessed something while they were driving, they avoid going to that place or anything that might remind them of that place. And you'll see negative changes in their thinking or their mood. So that could be things like memory problems or relationship difficulties, depression, numbness, and then changes in their physical and emotional reactions. So things like self-destructive or reckless behavior, just bad decision-making, irritability, and trouble sleeping. And so that's really a lot of the reactions that you'll see after trauma. And typically, most of the time people recover from experiencing some type of critical incident or traumatic event without much issue. So they may have a week or two where they're having trouble sleeping and they may be thinking about what happened a lot or having some racing thoughts, but ultimately it goes away on its own. And that's usually because they stick to their exercise routine, they engage socially with people, and they just kind of engage in pro-social and activities and have a good support system. The problem is that when it is a little bit longer than that. So in order for somebody to actually have the diagnosis of PTSD, the symptoms that I mentioned have to be occurring for at least a month. So they have to be ongoing and they have to be pretty significant. They have to cause some kind of impairment in a person's personal life or at work or at school or something like that. And so that's when it gets a little bit more difficult. And so that's when people will typically seek out professional help through a therapist or maybe through professional organizations, support groups, things like that.
So that's what all of us can experience and how we all process it. What then makes the difference for first responders and police officers?
Well, I think, the meme that you were talking about before is there's a lot of truth behind it. I don't know the numbers exactly, but of course, police officers are often exposed to traumatic events, seeing abused kids or dead bodies, severe assaults, involvement in shootings, mass casualty incidents, dealing with the grief and a lot of emotion from victims that they're working with. And this just compounds and accumulates over time. And so the average person, right, they may experience a number of traumatic events throughout their life. That, as far as the general population goes, about half of the population will experience some kind of trauma throughout their life. And that could be as small, like I said, as witnessing a really bad car accident when you're driving somewhere, to anything significant like experiencing sexual assault or witnessing a homicide or something like that. And of the general population, only 3 to 4% will go on to develop PTSD. But when you look at law enforcement, because of all of the trauma and the stress that they have from their career and the critical incidents that they experience day in and day out, there have been surveys, and 90% of police officers have been exposed to trauma. 79% have reported some type of critical incident stress reaction at some point in their career. So the numbers are absolutely staggering, and they're a lot higher. And it's estimated that on average, at any given time, you've got about 15 to 20% of officers that meet criteria for PTSD. You know, the problem, I think, is that the true scope is not known, because a lot of officers, in my experience, kind of, you know, they shut it down and they pretend that it doesn't exist. And so I would guess that those numbers are actually quite a bit higher.
So part of the problem that we're dealing with then is really people who don't want to admit that there's a problem to begin with.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the FOP, the Fraternal Order of Police, did a study back in 2018, specifically around officer mental health. And one of the things that they found was that 90% of respondents to the survey that they put out said that stigma is the biggest barrier to them seeking any kind of help. And so that can look like fear of losing their job or being sent for a fitness for duty evaluation, getting their gun taken away. They might be seen as weak. Other colleagues won't trust their judgment on calls, or they feel like there's a barrier because there's clinicians that won't understand their job. And then they feel further stigmatized by a clinician that asks stupid questions.
Well, and one of the reasons I'm thankful for the work that you've been doing, and happy to have you with us here today as somebody who does understand a lot of what is dealt with out there. I want to turn to somebody who has a personal story in that regard, and somebody who's been on both sides, in the helping side and on the experience side. Chaplain Lilly, you've agreed to share with us that story. Would you mind doing that for us now?
Yes, absolutely. So in 2001, I was a police officer with about 1.5 years on in the city of San Jose in Silicon Valley, California. It's a large city. I had a really good friend who was in the academy after me and who had just finished FTO and was signed off to his new team. We worked midnight, and he made a car stop, and it was of a suspect, or not so much a suspect, but of an individual who was reported to have assaulted someone at a party earlier that evening. So he saw this person, stopped him. They, without even being able to walk up to the person's car, the person shot him, just dead immediately. And of course, the department, everyone working that night rallied together, got to the scene. We did what needed to get done, and then we went back to work. And of course, you know, in the interim, prepared for his memorial and funeral. But I think because he was such a good friend, and we'd had little contests here and there, you know, who could make the first self-initiated felony arrest after all the calls for service died down, those kinds of things. It hit hard. My teammates realized after about a month, probably a little over 30 days or so, that I wasn't working like I had been. I wasn't full of energy, and I, as a brand new cop, they just thought, that's so not you. And we know Jeff's death is bothering you. So they didn't tell me anything, you know. I mean, fortunately, they knew me, I knew them, we were comfortable with each other, we trusted each other. They took it to the sergeant. All of them agreed without my knowledge that I needed to see the chaplain. And the chaplain at the time, God rest his soul, his name was David Bridgen. He met with me after briefing, probably at 10 o'clock at night, 10:30. And we sat in the parking lot and he just let me talk. He asked me a few questions. He acknowledged where he thought, my pain was coming from. He told me how much my teammates cared about me and my sergeant cared about me, and that they missed me at work, even though I was present. I wasn't present. So he didn't evangelize. He didn't talk about religion. He just made me feel comfortable. I'd never even known we had a chaplain. That's how strange it was for me. And it's funny, I'd been a religious all my life. I just never even occurred to me to have to need something like this. I think I was in true denial that I was bothered. But fortunately, my team noticed. They were just so caring and paid so much attention, and they weren't afraid to say, you need help. And I think because of meeting that chaplain and then developing a relationship with him over the 11 years that I worked there, that's how I ended up doing this today. So I hope that answers or addresses what you'd wanted me to say, but that's pretty much what happened.
No, I think that personal story is huge. One, countering, to counter that stigma that we all face, that the help may not be what a lot of officers, to some extent, what I thought it was, as we need that help. And two, to have officers recognize that sometimes we need a push to get that help, to get that first conversation going. And then three, things turned out well, right? I mean, that's the gist of the story ultimately, is that you returned to the officer that you had been.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah. And after that, I did not hesitate whenever I needed to talk to someone really personal about something very private, to contact either Chaplain Dave or someone on his team, because I knew it would go nowhere other than me and him or me and her. And that it was great to have that resource. I also advocate for what Dr. Coleman does. I'd been through other traumas even long before I became a police officer, but it's funny how certain things on the job triggered those traumas. And you had mentioned some of them, from childhood abuse. And so it was really important for me throughout my career to actually see a professional doctor as well as clergy. And I think both pretty much saved my life. So that's what I try to reiterate to officers today. There's no harm in both. So.
Well, and somebody who's spent his life in service and also encouraging folks to talk about that is Chief Gang. Chief Gang, we've heard from the professional psychologist on some of the difference, and from somebody who walked in the beat and had some of those stress issues. Talk to us about individual trauma and police stress and why we need that extra concern and care.
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for having me, Anthony. It's really a pleasure. I'm blessed to be with this great panel. First off, there's a couple of things that I want to touch on that was spoken about. And hopefully, Dr. Coleman maybe could share with us, but ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, I think it's what it stands for, but I learned a little bit about that. Certainly, I'm not a doctor, and I always throw out the disclaimer before I start speaking that I'm not a doctor or a psychologist. So maybe she could share a little bit of that, but a lot of officers don't realize that it was such a big development of our personalities due to those type of things. So maybe she could share a little bit about that later on. But, you shared some numbers. I'm going to share some numbers too. the first number is 3, and I always ask 3 questions. And when I typically go around the country, I ask these 3 questions. One is, do you know somebody who died by suicide? And typically the audience responds either with their hands raised, or what I've been doing interactively, asking them then turn on their cell phone light and hold it up. So I asked the 3 questions. Do you personally know somebody who died by suicide? Some people put their lights on, they hold them up. The next question is, has your organization had a death by suicide? And then more lights come up. And then by the 3rd question, the entire room looks like it's lit up like a night sky. And it is, do you know somebody right now who may be struggling? Alcohol addiction, maybe prescription medication, maybe they're going through a divorce, maybe they're struggling at work. And if so, turn on your light. And by the end of those 3 questions, the entire room's lit up. And then my last question to them is, if you know somebody who's struggling right now, what are you doing as a leader? Number 1, what are you doing in your organization about that? And number 2, if you know somebody, the minimum we could do is reach out, right? Send a text. How are you doing? Ask them if they're okay. We have to normalize these type of conversations where it makes it acceptable to speak about these things, right? Because the number 1 thing we need to do is raise awareness, creating an environment where it's okay not to be okay, and not to use that cliche because it's all over the place now, right? Even the NFL is using it, but doing something to bring things back to okay. Taking those conversations out of the shadows and into the open, having conversations, and leadership to be vulnerable to share their stories. Because once we start sharing our stories, it makes it normal and makes it open for other people to share their stories. I do believe that. I think there's been a greater need in our profession for leaders to create a culture of wellness in their organization. Now, there's a difference between a culture of wellness and an organizational wellness program, right? So we need to build organizational cultural wellness. And the other thing we have to do is stop talking about officer wellness programs and talk about organizational wellness, because officer wellness can be exclusive to your civilian staff. And a lot of people think it's just for the officers, and it's not. It's for all our employees. So that's one big component. And the other thing that I think this has to be our highest priority, right? It has to be our number 1 priority, because our human resources is our biggest asset and our resource. So we have to treat it as such, and certainly understand the concept of human behind the badge, that our people are just human beings doing a job, and this is not who they are, it's what they do, is really important, right? We're susceptible to all other life challenges, plus the fact that the most challenging season in our profession right now, with the civil unrest and all those type of things, along with the global pandemic, is really causing a lot of uncertainty for our profession. So here's some of the numbers that you talked about. Certainly this year, 138 officers have already died by suicide. I believe that was the number yesterday. So that's a number we need to think about. 239 is what I had for 2019, but 236 doesn't really make a difference, right? It's still people that are dying by suicide. The biggest number we need to talk about is the 2.5. And what that number represents is the factor of what our experts are saying could be underreported by. So even if you go back to 2019, right? 236, 239, if it's underreported by a factor of 2.5, over 500 officers died by suicide that year. I mean, we're losing double the amount of officers to suicide and all of the line of duty deaths combined. So we're talking about shootings, collisions, heart attacks. Put them over here, and officers dying by suicide is up here. It's an epidemic. We need to do something. And leadership really has to start focusing on bringing solution-focused approaches to help our people. Part of that is partnering with culturally competent people who understand our profession, right? Dr. Coleman, people like Dr. Coleman who understand the profession. Because I have tons of stories where people are going out to these EAP programs and they're meeting with non-culturally competent people, and it's destroying them. In that study that Dr. Coleman brought up about the 8,000 people that were studied in New York about EAPs and whether or not they thought there's a stigma, 85% said that they knew they had an EAP program in their organization but would never use it. Because many people at our level think EAP stands for Employees Assistance Program, but our employees think it means expose and punish. Expose and punish, right? They're afraid to use these programs. They think we get reports back. They think they're going to be exposed. So no one's willing to use these type of programs. So we need to start thinking about EAP could be a component of our organizational wellness program, but it can't be your program, right? Because you're going to lose people, and studies have shown that. The other number I'll share is 188, and this is a different study than maybe you're sharing. The study that I am referring to is an obscure study where it says 188 major traumatic events is what an officer will sustain over their career, when the average citizen may have 2 to 5 over their career, right? I'm kind of a simple person. We have a lot of educated people on this panel, but I'm kind of a simple guy. So if you're walking around with a basket And every single time you have a traumatic event, you represent as an egg and you put that into your basket. Sooner or later, you're not going to be able to fit any more eggs in that basket, right? It could be a call that you've handled 1,000 times in your career, and just that one time is going to set you over. So we have to find ways to resource, partner with culturally competent people to reduce that trauma throughout their careers, right? That's really, really important. There's a white paper study out of San Diego. I believe her name is Jessica Dockstetter. And what the result of that paper said is cumulative trauma over time that goes untreated will lead a person to be more aggressive to themselves and others. I'll repeat it one more time. Cumulative trauma over time that goes untreated will lead the person to be more aggressive to themselves and others. That's really important to understand, right? We're flagging systems for use of force, and we'll deal with it at a disciplinary level, but we're finding out what the root causes are. Are our supervisors sitting down and finding out why things are occurring, why people are late, why their performance is dipping? We need to get to the why. We need to get to the human aspect and find out why these things are happening. And then 5X I'll share with you. 5X says that officers are more likely to sustain PTSD type symptoms, like Dr. Coleman was mentioning earlier, or depression over their career, right? But we have to educate them as leaders that that's not a career ender, right? These are brain injuries. We can rehab, they can come back to work bigger and stronger than they were before, but we have to discuss these things. PTSD does not have to be a career ender, but if we talk about these as injuries, right? Instead of sending them to therapists, maybe we're going to send them to a mental health coach where they can rehab and get back to normal, like what Glorybelle was talking about. That's really, really important. But who's sharing that story? And then the last number before I turn it over is 4. And that's 4 passionate people that are on this panel right now that are here to help people, that if they reach out, we'll provide resources for them. Because we need to turn these tragedies into hope. And that's how I built out the Astral Model. And maybe later on we'll have a chance to talk about that. But we have to allow people the courage and also the space, the vulnerability to reach out and get help. So if you're on the listening to the panel today and you're one of those people, you have our support, you have the courage, step up, make a phone call, and we'll get you some help. But we have to know that there's going to be no stigma behind that, because we all need help at sometimes. And I think it's really, really important that we are all vulnerable and we all can use help. So reach out. Thank you.
No, Chief, thank you. And that's one of the reasons I was really excited that you were able to join us today, because I think that's key for especially those dispatchers, officers on the road, those frontline employees, to know that there are administrators out there who are advocating we need to make this not only stigma-free, but repercussion-free as we talk about these things. We are going to come back, and I want to get into the Astral Model, but you started down a road that I want to continue and get our panel to circle back on, that we need, one, you addressed PTSD as an injury, right? So how much, I'll play the devil's advocate here a little bit, how much do you think organizations, police departments, city agencies are pushing to rule this not as an injury, so it's not something that they have to deal with?
Well, I don't really know what the answer is to that, but let's talk about a couple things, right? We see all these suicides, and many organizations refuse to even admit that they had a suicide in their organization because they're embarrassed by that. But there is a discussion out there, right? If you're seeing the numbers of 188 major traumatic events that are occurring in your career, right, and that's happening because of the result of your career, shouldn't these be career related? So those are conversations to have. Like, I don't think there's any end result. I don't think this panel is going to be able to come to a result today, but it's something to think about, right? People are dying because of this, and they're dying because of suicide, because of the trauma that's sustained at work. Should they be considered in the line of duty deaths? I certainly don't have that answer right now, but it's certainly worth a discussion to have. And certainly, I don't know if Dr. Coleman maybe can share a little bit of her insight of why some of the organizations are handling them the way they are. I could certainly tell you that if we certainly deal with these as any other injury, right? And we will talk about that like any other injury, right? Our people will sit in a briefing room and raise their hand and say, hey, I got a torn knee, I'm gonna get scoped and come back to work, but we're not willing to share brain injuries. That's why I think it's really, really imperative that leadership opens that door and starts the conversation, not just sits behind, in their ivory tower, sits behind the desk and pushes out programs.
Well, and as you said, sir, we're talking about human resources being the greatest asset of any organization, and whether you look at that financially or potential, it comes back to the people that you're dealing with. If we're not taking care of their mental health initially through these critical incidents, how much of that is going to come back on the organization through the alcoholism, through the suicides, through the repercussions of not dealing with this? So I love that you're out there advocating it. And Dr. Coleman, I didn't want to jump in to cut you off, but the chief asked you a question, so we'll relay that to you.
How could I not answer? To Chief Gang's point, I think that there's a number of reasons why organizations don't treat suicides as line of duty deaths, and it's really believing the myths around suicide. So one of the biggest myths about suicide is that a person that follows through with a suicide and kills themselves is that it's cowardly. And I think that they don't want to glorify something that is seen as cowardly, especially amongst a group of men, right, that are heroes. They're not cowards. The fact of the matter is that people who kill themselves, it rarely has to do with them being cowards. It has to do with them feeling like they're in a cold, dark room and suicide is the only door out. And organizations can do their part to help that person see the other doors that may be available to them. And I think also organizations don't want to go through with the big processions and all of the like everything that goes along with a line of duty death funeral, all of the pageantry around it for a suicide, because they don't want other officers to think that that's the way out. And I feel like those are two huge myths. And the reality is that people aren't going to start killing themselves so that they can get a beautiful funeral, right? Like when you break it down, that's just not what's going to happen. So I think that suicides should be treated like line of duty deaths, just like when officers have acquired COVID on the job and they die from it, those are also ruled as line of duty deaths. Is there any way to truly prove that they got COVID from the line of duty? Probably not, but it's being treated as such. And so until we start seeing mental health in the same lane as physical health, I think that we're going to continue to see these problems. And the last thing that I'll mention that's kind of to both of your points is that I do think that there's some movement in seeing PTSD as a work injury. Simply, if you look at the legislation that a lot of states have been passing that see PTSD for specifically first responders, they're now allowing them to, get workers' compensation funding for that. So I think that that's a step in the right direction, that states are seeing that as an on-duty injury.
And I think more places are recognizing the wear and tear on first responders. I know New Jersey just passed a law that allows for law enforcement retirement after 20 years, regardless of age, while it was previously 55, which I know Chief Gang can support. That's a long time to work in law enforcement. It's tough to chase after young kids when we're not so young anymore. Now, Chaplain Lilly, we're talking about organizational structures here, and you work in an organization that has provided for a full-time chaplain, which I think is hugely commendable. And you mentioned briefly earlier, you're not there to evangelize. You're not there to preach any kind of faith. You're there for mental health. So tell us a little more about that and how you think other agencies can pick that up.
Well, personally, all our chaplains are a little different. I am actually one of the only ones out of our whole team that has never been a pastor. But I am also the only chaplain on the team that was a police officer in the past. So we all kind of handle things a little differently, but the same goal is to let the officers and dispatchers and anyone in the organization know that they can come to us with their story, that they're basically protected. They don't have to worry about us reporting that story to anyone else because we are ordained clergy and we have that clergy privilege. I don't diagnose anyone, but I understand those aspects. I understand the DSM just because I've seen so many professionals for my own needs. Both, work-related and personal related. You know, I'm a person of faith, right? So I try to integrate the two, but very gently. Of course, like you said, I don't want to scare anyone away by evangelizing religion or faith, but I try to convey to them through behavior, through understanding that you know, they're not alone. We're not alone. If you have, there comes a time in a person's life when they have looked for help everywhere. They have just gone to people, things, alcohol, drugs, you know, whatever addiction they have, and they still get no relief, right? And sometimes they come to their own realization, or with a gentle prodding from a chaplain, if they come to us, maybe open it up a little bit and just ask your God for help, you know, and we're here to help you through that. But certainly it's not something we shove down anyone's throat at the police department. Mostly we're there to understand someone's story, you know, whether they're religious or not. That's what we do as chaplains with fire and police, or police and fire, I should say. And that's our calling. That's certainly my calling. Again, chaplains have 100% confidentiality. So their story is safe with us. We've found, and I've definitely found, that this opens doors for an officer or dispatcher or whoever has come to us to really get down to the real issue. The real issue that is causing them so much pain that they do feel, as Dr. Coleman said, like they're in that dark room and there's no way out. You know, because they know, and I think we reiterated over and over, that their story will not go beyond us. And so we try to assure them. There is a stigma though, and Anthony, you and I talked about this when we met. There's a stigma still. Even sometimes I feel it. When I want to talk about something bothering me today, I really have to think about who I'm going to talk to, because I think part of me still has that fear, you know, but I know it's an unfounded fear for at least where I am. So I'm hoping that more departments, both across public safety, you know, police and fire, become more supportive in that regard, and just let them know that there are resources, you know, both professionally, clergy, peer support. The peer support is a huge thing. You know, if they know that they can go to another officer and just unload without the officer going up to the sergeant or anywhere else, that's huge.
Well, and you talked about that stigma a little bit, and I think, and the fear behind it, I think, and of course I'll defer to Dr. Coleman's expertise, but I think as humans, we all experience that fear of judgment whenever we share anything. And of course, as those who work in a profession of machismo, of bravado, there's a little extra stigma that goes along with that. But how much of it do you think, and I'll use your words here, you dealt with not just a tragedy, but a personal trauma, the loss of a friend, and went back to work? And we're not talking about had days off and you went back to work that night. How much of it do you think that reinforces the suck it up stigma, and we have to be able to deal with this?
You know, I will say that night I didn't even think about sucking it up. I just thought, we've got to help each other. We've still got calls for service. We've got to figure out how to help Jeff's family, you know? So I think later, as it hit me and I just wanted to mourn my friend, that was when I started to say, you know, I got bills to pay. I've got to suck it up. I don't have enough PTO to take, you know? I just have to go to work. And you're right, it compounds. I think, Chief, you had mentioned that cumulative trauma over time. So it does lend to the stigma, I think. But certainly there are so many other things. Upbringing can lead to that stigma, right? I mean, it doesn't even have to be related to your job. but the home you were raised in, the friends you grew up with. There's so many people that I know when I was first struggling, before I even thought about professional help. I mean, I didn't want my own family to know. So I guess it just, so many things to factor in. What I'd wish I'd known back then in 2001 as a new officer was, I'd wish I'd known that there was a chaplain, you know. I didn't. I just wish I wasn't so driven by, I don't want to sound terrible when I say this, but ego. I mean, it was a lot of ego, right? Especially, I think I was one of maybe 100, not even that, female officers. And San Jose Police Department at the time had over 1,000 sworn officers. And, you know, the last thing I want to do is appear like I had issues. So it depends on your background, I think, that stigma. Some have no problem talking to someone for help, and I think that's wonderful. So we just have to kind of talk to the individual, you know, try not to blanket so much, because each person's trauma is different. Each person's experience on the job is different. Yeah, I hope that helps. I hope that answered you.
Well, it certainly answered me. Again, I'm hoping that this conversation helps a lot of folks out there. We're closing in on our last few minutes. I want to give everybody the opportunity to talk briefly about what you think either community as a whole or department, governmental agency sponsoring the department can do to help general mental wellness, as Chief Gang said, organizational mental wellness. So Chaplain, I'll give you first opportunity, and we'll rotate back to Chief Gang.
So this kind of communication between community at large, right, in the department and everyone at the department, it's definitely a two-way street. I can't speak for other departments at this time, but I know where I am currently. They do a lot of just social programming events for the community. So, for example, right now, you know, there's Blue Santa. So through the school districts, the police department has gotten referrals for families in need. They just, parents or whoever's taking care of these kids don't have enough money to buy Christmas presents. So things like that, events like that, they advertise it well. And what we always just ask, everyone gets behind it on their social media and says, you know, hey, community, let's help these kids. You know, these are your kids' friends. So what the community can do is be on the lookout for events like that the police department holds and sponsors, and just volunteer to be a part of it. And then when the officers see that involvement, it is a morale boost for them to know that the community has rallied, whether it's for, you know, a cause for the officers themselves or for the community that the officers help. So, you know, I think those social programs and events have helped a lot in bridging the gap.
Absolutely. And Dr. Coleman, we know that agencies can contract with your agency for support, certainly locally. What are some other more general events or acts that they can take?
Well, I think one is to prioritize the wellness of their employees. I know, and Chief Gang had mentioned organizational wellness and creating that culture. And so I think that's one of the best things that organizations can do. And of course, that takes money, but I think that there's a huge return on investment. You're going to see people who are more present when they're at work, who are calling in less often. You're going to see less turnover and things like that. So I think there is a return on investment there. Invest in your peer support teams. As Glorybelle had mentioned, you know, chaplains and peer support teams are, you know, they are part of the organization. And a lot of times people don't want to talk to a shrink. There's still a lot of stigma around talking to a doctor about it, and talking to somebody that you feel like understands the job it can be huge. And so making sure that you have well-trained peer supporters and chaplains that have integrity and uphold confidentiality. I'm thankful that there's a lot of states that have it also enacted in legislation that supports full confidentiality for their peer support team members. So giving them an added protection. And I think it was last month that the president signed into law the same thing for federal law enforcement agencies and their peer support teams. So that's a huge step in the right direction. And I think the community, what they can do is they can support politicians and communities and agencies that want to do this, right? Because it does take money. And so the last thing you want to do is strip departments of funding that they desperately need for this type of stuff and for training. Because as Chief Gang mentioned, the study where people who have experienced cumulative trauma are more likely to engage in aggressive behaviors towards themselves or others. Well, that's the last thing you want as a community, right? Are aggressive police officers that are engaging in excessive use of force. So it just seems like a no-brainer to me. I think maybe we just need to communicate it a little bit more clearly.
Yeah, and regardless of whether or not it's aggression through use of force, it can be aggression in the interpersonal dealings. You've got those family relationships and the repercussions of that. You know, a lot of police officers will be coaches or mentors in some other area, and this doesn't just affect that job area, right?
Mm-hmm.
Chief Gang, your thoughts closing, sir, and whatever time you want to take to explain the Astral Model. We've got about 10 minutes left, sir.
Okay, well, thank you. Again, I always take notes because I always learn things from the panels, and certainly learning from each other, being lifelong learners is really, really important, right? A couple things before I get into your original question of what we could do with the community, but you know, it's not the big one, right? We know how to do that, right? We know how to do the debriefings for the shootings, the suicides, maybe the critical incidents. It's these little traumas that happen all the time that continue to build up. That's what we need to address, and that's what we have to try and do to alleviate those type of things, right? We have this transferable trauma that happens. An officer goes to his first call after he gets out of the shoot, and it's maybe a death of a baby. Oh, what are we doing for that officer? Typically, the answer is nothing. Now they're going to 3 or 4 calls, and by the end of the day, they're dealing with like maybe a delayed incident, and maybe it's a bike theft. And now they're losing control over that because of all this trauma that left on, and right, this transferable trauma. So we have to find ways of leaders to identify trauma and be able to reduce that trauma as it's occurring, right? So we're going to work with some culturally competent people to talk about developing something called a critical incident reset, where if you have that trauma, perhaps you take them off the street for 15, 20 minutes, maybe work out, reduce some cortisol levels. Maybe there's some other things we can do to help reduce that trauma before they go transfer it throughout all the rest of the calls that are going on. So that was one thing that came up. I think, the chaplain, which she was talking about earlier, it's one of my points. It's number 6 when it comes to spirituality, but creating a chaplain program that's not a check off the box, right? It's the fabric of your organization. Right, they're there, they're going on ride-alongs, they're part of the organization, people see them, they're comfortable. It's normal for the chaplain to be contacted. It's normal for the chaplain to be riding with an officer. The last thing you want to do is just do a checkbox program, right? If you're a leader out there looking to do checkbox program, becomes an officer wellness, it may be time just to kind of wave that white flag, step aside and let someone step into your seat, because that's not going to help. It's going to hurt the organization. And the bottom line is, right, you want them to be there. So, why is Officer Jones riding with the chaplain today? What's the problem, right? That should never happen. It should be normalized. So I'm glad to see that Glorybelle and their team is really doing a great job when it comes to that. When you ask the question, what can we do with the community? Something we could do. We could share our narrative, share our story. How many people in our community right now know those numbers that we shared with this panel? Probably nobody. We don't do a good job of sharing our successes. So we need to share those type of stories, right? We need to either do presentations to council, to our mayors. We need to do to the legislators of how trauma and suicide's affecting this organization, because then maybe federal funding will become available and we can better equip ourselves to be able to deal with these things. But again, I think we do a poor job of sharing our narrative. I would venture to say if someone on this is listening today, go out to your community and ask in a community setting, how many officers die by suicide? They probably don't even know what you're talking about, because we don't share these, right? News media doesn't share them, right? So those are things that we have to do to share our narrative. And then, of course, again, I talked about the fabric of the organization, but creating an opportunity where organizational wellness is the key, right? It's the culture of what you're doing, not an officer wellness program. And I'll submit to you today, I think that the difference between organizational wellness and just an officer wellness program could be the leadership of your organization, how they treat it, right? Is it just a leader who's coming in and putting a program together to say he checked off a box and is moving on? Or it's somebody who's really diving into it, who's sharing their story, going to briefings, going to trainings, and bringing people in and sharing their own story and being a part of that? Or are they just sharing these things and moving on and sitting in the ivory tower waiting for the next time they have an opportunity to do a PR event, right? That's not the type of leadership these organizations need now. You know, we developed something called the Astral Model, and it was in tribute of a buddy of mine who died by suicide in the 90s. You know, I don't have time to share the entire story right now. Well, one day maybe I'll have an opportunity, but really it's a result of a traumatic event happening and no resources happening. The most important thing in my 33-year career happened the day after he died by suicide. And that was when I went to the police department and nothing happened. Not a conversation, not a resource, not a chaplain, not a chief, not a command staff person was in our briefing. It was go 10-8 and handle business, like what they did with Glorybelle. Go back to work. Like, what's the problem here? And you know what? At that time, that's all we knew, right? The landscape wasn't the way it is now. We didn't have CISM. We didn't have peer support teams the way we do now. But now, you know, 20 years later, here we are. We have all these things, but our numbers are still increasing. So we have to do a better job of getting this information out. I remember walking out in my car that day, sat down in my car, and I go, if I ever have an opportunity to do something and get into a position of leadership and change the way I'm feeling today back in the 90s, so no one else has to feel this way, and change the landscape of police suicide, I'll do that. And this Astral Model resonated with me really for 20 years. And really, it's just a 7-point approach. And I'll be honest with you, it's no great piece of literacy. It's a 7-point approach because that's the badge we wear out here in the Bay Area. So each point represents a different skill set. Number one, awareness. We got to raise awareness, right? Creating an environment where it's okay to not be okay and bringing these conversations out of the shadows. 2 is a solution-focused approach, whatever your organization decides what that looks like. But we have to have a solution-focused approach. You can't just talk about the awareness. We decided to go with something called the Cortical Wellness app. That just worked for our organization. And if someone has any questions about that, they can reach out to me. But having a resource for our employees to have 24/7, 365 access to confidential and anonymous resources is a game winner, right? It's a game changer. So whatever that looks like for your organization, I'm certainly, there's some great other apps out there. Lighthouse is a good app. There's other apps out there, and there's other resources, but knowing it has to be confidential and anonymous, it has to be your strategy. 3 is peer support, proactive peer support team. Very, very effective, low cost, but to be able to have a trained peer support team available. And then bringing in culturally competent people like Dr. Coleman to teach you on resiliency, what trauma even means, what's the difference between PTSD and PTSI, you know, mindfulness, you know, yoga for first responders, all those type of things. What's out there? We have to train our people in those type of areas so they're educated. Healthy habits, being able to work out, eat healthy, partnering with meal prep companies, maybe to bring in healthy meals into your organization. So when time is a time crunch, they're not going through, you know, a drive-through eating crappy food, but having those meals readily available. Not just for that, but there's a lot of single parents out there who are working on the job. You want them to be able to bring meals home if it's late. They don't have to go home and cook at 9, 10 o'clock at night. So having that available. 6 is spirituality. I am definitely a man of faith, but I'm not going to share that my entire story with you today, but certainly having something out there, knowing that there's a greater purpose than ourselves that's out there, you know, driving things. Certainly developing a police clergy coalition, having a proactive chaplain program, which we talked about earlier. And then number 7 is family, getting our families involved. You know, typically in our profession, families are not involved in our profession, right? We got into this in the 80s and 90s. They were told you that your family doesn't mix with your professional life and personal life never mix. Well, we can't compartmentalize like that. Years later, I understand the reason why they told us that, because all our sergeants had beat wives, right? So they didn't want those two things connecting. So if they went to a Christmas party, you didn't use the wrong name. But that was the real reason, right? It was very, very it was a poor reason not to use that, right? And you can't compartmentalize like that. But my biggest thing about family is have them involved from the time they get sworn in to the time they retire. Because the bottom line is they need to champion our causes when they're not at work. Right? When they come to work, they're going to mask their feelings. I've never been in an organization where I walk down the hallway and say, how you doing, officer? Well, I'm really doing crappy, chief. I'm an alcoholic. I'm taking drugs. I'm going through a divorce. I feel like killing myself, right? That's not going to happen. But they're going to show the red flags when they're at home, right? Their loved one may be more despondent. They're drinking more. They're more angry at home. We need to create a conveyance for them to reach out to our peer support teams or our command staff to say, hey, I have a concern. My loved one is struggling and I need you to help me get help. So talking about those type things. And then the last thing before I push it off is educating our people, number one, on financial fitness. We have to break down the stigma when it comes to financial fitness. You know, these psychological autopsies are being done. A high percentage of these autopsies showing that there's a financial component to that. Our people don't know what it means to save money, right? They come out of the academy and they're driving nicer trucks than the chief. That's a problem, right? Right, because I'm jealous, but besides that, but they have to be able to have, you know, to understand what it means to go out and spend $90,000 on a truck when they're not even off probation yet. We have to bring in financial fitness advisors to teach them what that means, what deferred comp looks like, what their retirement is going to look like. Go around, quiz your people in your briefings, see if they even know what deferred comp means. I guarantee you take a study right now about the majority of people are going to say they put $100 into the deferred comp. Why do you think that happens? Because they go over and sign the paperwork. They don't read the paperwork. They ask the HR person, what should I do? Put $100 in there. They put $100 in there and that's what they do. They don't touch it for the rest of their career. And they think they can retire on that. It's just a bad strategy. So we have to educate them and help them through that process. And then the last thing I'll touch on, I'll turn it back over to you, Anthony, is retirement. We're losing far too many people due to retirement. They're spending 20, 30 years in this profession. They're spending a month out and then they're dying by suicide after they retire. We have to be able to counsel them on what this is going to look like. What in 5 years, you're going to be retiring. We need you to understand that you're not this badge and patch, right? That's what you do for a living. That's not who you are. Develop hobbies outside this profession so you could be successful when you retire. Not that the day you retire, you go, oh, crap, I have no idea who I am and I just lost my identity. Well, there's far too many people that spent a lifetime serving our communities that are dying by suicide. Us as leaders have to partner together and do something different. And I'll finish with this. I think we have to lead with love. I think this profession has done a really poor job. We've had autocratic leaders that didn't care about their people. We have to lead with love, understand that we have to be vulnerable and share those things. We still hold people accountable, but still care about them and understand that they're human beings. And the other thing I'll say, if you're listening today, one person can change the world, right? Mother Teresa, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, they changed the entire world. If you're listening today, you can go back to your organization, change your culture. I guarantee it. If you have a little bit of passion, a little bit of resiliency, partner with culturally competent people, you can change what's going on in your organization. And then the last thing, if you're a leader right now, I'll say, be the leader that you would be inspired to follow. I'll repeat it one more time. Be that leader that you would be inspired to follow. And hopefully together we could partner together, change outcomes, and reduce police suicides.
I think he's dropping the mic after that, folks. Chief, and no joke, Chief, but greatly appreciate you sharing the Astral Model with us today. And I'm going to hope that there are a lot of law enforcement leaders that will hear this, listen to that part, and reach out to you to get some advice on applying that to their organization. I don't know if Panola is hiring, but I think you just did a great job recruiting, because I don't know any cops that wouldn't want to work for somebody that has that kind of care for their organization. And I think your leadership really shone through in that, and whether that came from your lifelong study or your faith or a combination of all that and your experience, I certainly think we need a lot more folks out leading in that regard with the care for their organization.
Well, we are hiring, number one, so we'll be more than happy to take you. We don't have mandatory vaccinations, so come on over. We won't stab you.
There you go. We'll make sure to spread that out. For those in attendance, I think you got a lot out of it. This relatively short conversation today, and Chief Gang's point, I hope, will echo throughout the season. You are cared about. We do care about you, and there is someone waiting to help you. There's a panel full of people if you need that help. And if you're not on the front lines, if you're not wearing a uniform, reach out to those that are. Just give them a thanks and wish them a Merry Christmas. From those of us here at Peace to those of you out there, stay graceful and have a Merry Christmas.